Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center's virtual panel on the gendered impact of forced displacement in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Afghanistan. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I'm the director of the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. We are hosting today's discussion to mark World Refugee Day, which is on June 20th, with a sponsorship from the Wilson Center's Refugee and Forced Displaced Initiative, RAFD, the Environmental Change and Security Program, the Maternal Health Initiative, and the Indo-Pacific Program. In the past two decades, conflict in the Middle East and North Africa region, and of course, in the last few years after the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, have forced millions to flee their homes in Iraq, the Palestinian Territories, Syria, Sudan, Libya, Yemen, and as I mentioned, in Afghanistan. As the world is witnessing another wave of forced displacement in Gaza, with 1.7 million Palestinians forcefully displaced internally in Gaza, about 9 million internally displaced in Sudan, in addition to more than 7 million internally displaced in Syria, 5 million Syrian refugees hosted in neighboring countries, and over 1 million in Iraq. The vulnerability of women and girls to the harsh realities of forced displacement has never been more visible and acute. From the lack of access to maternal and reproductive health services, basic health and sanitation, and increased gender-based violence, women and girls face tremendous stresses on their physical and psychological well-being and constraints on their livelihoods, their families, and their communities. We are truly honored today to kick off our discussion with remarks and a moderated chat with Lindsay Jenkins, who serves as Senior Advisor for Migration Policy at the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Her responsibilities include promoting safe, orderly, humane, and regular migration and protections for vulnerable migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless people. She also facilitates multilateral responses to the impact of climate change on migration and forced displacement. We will then turn to an expert panel to zoom into the Syrian refugee crisis, the situation in Gaza amongst the forcefully displaced Palestinians, Afghanistan, and a view from international humanitarian organization, particularly IRC. Lindsay, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marissa. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the kind introduction, and thank you very much to the Wilson Center for inviting me to mark World Refugee Day with you. My name is Lindsay Jenkins, and as you heard, I'm a Senior Advisor in the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. This day, World Refugee Day, is near and dear to PRM's mission as the State Department's Humanitarian Bureau. Our work centers on the human face of foreign policy, and that's exactly what I hope to highlight today in my opening keynote. As you heard, the data on displaced person are sobering. According to UNHCR, 117 million people were forcibly displaced by conflict, violence, persecution, and other human rights abuses last year. Half of those are women and girls. All refugees, asylum seekers, and vulnerable migrants deserve safety from exploitation, violence, and abuse. And yet we know that on the ground, both conflicts and disasters exacerbate many of the existing gender inequalities in a society. We've seen the detrimental impacts on women accessing assistance during a humanitarian response. That includes access to food, shelter, water and sanitation, health services, and other types of life-saving assistance. And we know that the threat of gender-based violence, which is rooted in gender inequality, is further amplified in crises. For example, in Gaza, the destruction of health infrastructure has left some 155,000 pregnant women without prenatal and postpartum care. Humanitarian agencies remain unable to bring in adequate numbers of healthcare workers or to import sufficient medical supplies to support maternal health care and women's reproductive health needs. Increasing protection risks, particularly among female heads of household, may leave women and girls forced to resort to negative coping mechanisms. We also know that the climate crisis exacerbates these impacts. We're deeply concerned to see that women and girls in the region disproportionately experience the impacts of water scarcity and food insecurity, declining health outcomes, and migration and displacement. In addition, existing gender inequalities related to women's rights, including nationality rights and access to full and equal participation in governance, can also stifle a society for generations after a conflict or disaster. The MENA region has the highest concentration in the world of gender discriminatory nationality laws, which is also one of the primary causes of statelessness in the region. Roughly half of the 25 countries in the world that deny women equal rights to pass nationality to their own children are in the MENA region. These are just some examples to set the scene. I'm sure our expert panelists will provide more insights from their own experiences. While we've come so far as an international community to recognize and address the gendered impacts of displacement, we still have a long way to go. With this in mind, the United States is committed to providing and promoting the rights and empowerment of women and girls as a life-saving priority and an integral part of every humanitarian response. It's not just the right thing to do, as we all know on this line, it's the strategic thing to do. I'd like to talk about some of the examples of the programs and advocacy we're doing at the U.S. State Department to advance this commitment in the region. The State Department and USAID have been working together since 2013 through our flagship Safe from the Start initiative. And in December of 2022, we launched an expansion of that initiative called Safe from the Start Re-envisioned. The goal is to protect all individuals, and in particular, women and girls, from all forms and threats of gender-based violence, or GBV, in emergencies. The initiative calls on everyone in the humanitarian community to take collective action to prioritize GBV prevention from the onset of every humanitarian response. For over a decade, our investments in key humanitarian agencies have led to institutional changes and increased capacity of international organizations, their partners, their local staff, and national government staff. For example, PRM provided funding to UNHCR to conduct roving GBV emergency deployments to monitor programs and train frontline workers in Syria and Iraq. With PRM support, IOM's MENA region office officially launched a regional GBV and crisis framework that will help disseminate best practices and continue strengthening institutional efforts on addressing GBV in crisis settings. Safe from the Start funding to IOM has also piloted initiatives and activities under the Women's Participation Project that supports opportunities for women's equal and meaningful participation in camp governance. For example, in Yemen, women in IDP camps are trained in literacy and livelihood skills with the goal of creating their own businesses. Beyond Safe from the Start, PRM funds work to address the gendered impacts of displacement at the regional and country levels as well. For example, we funded the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, in Turkey to provide GBV programming for refugees and displaced host communities before and after the devastating earthquakes in February 2023. Services ranged from GBV awareness and prevention workshops to medical support, intake, and legal counseling. We've also supported UNFPA in Jordan on preventing child marriage through empowerment programming such as youth-focused centers. 50 to 60% of marriages in Zatri and Asrat camps in Jordan are child marriages. And we continue to look at how displacement increases the risks of GBV through negative coping mechanisms like child marriage, which has a cascade of negative consequences for women and girls across their entire life course. Finally, since 2018, PRM has funded Empower Aid Project with the George Washington University's Global Women's Institute. This is a multi-country project where refugee women and girls directly inform aid actors on the risks of sexual exploitation and abuse that they face during the aid distribution process. The aid organizations then implement these women and girls' recommendations and measure how they worked. So in terms of outcomes, we're already seeing them. For example, in Syrian refugee women and girls living in Lebanon reported that disorganization and overcrowding during food distributions was putting them at risk of harassment and targeting. So the partner piloted two approaches to delivering food, one by arranging small groups to come to the distribution site at pre-assigned times, and another one through door-to-door drop-off. In both cases, women and girls reported a greater sense of safety under both of these models. And in the Al-Aqsa refugee camp in Jordan, adolescent girls reported feeling afraid of being exploited or abused while traveling to access services or to attend school. So the local partner set up a group travel system, which led to an increased sense of security. These recommendations may sound simple or common sense, but they underscore how important it is to recognize women and girls as experts in their own protection who can and should be meaningfully engaged and actively consulted in mitigating risks. Finally, In addition to our programming at the regional and global levels, we engage in humanitarian advocacy and diplomacy. We actively support women's equal nationality rights in various forums, including the high-level segment on statelessness in 2019, where we committed to champion laws that reform countries that have nationality laws that discriminate against women. And we put forward and delivered on that pledge during a Human Rights Council resolution in 2013 or 2023 that passed with consensus to stop arbitrary or unlawful discrimination, including equal rights and promoting equal rights and solutions to statelessness. In closing, this year, we know that UNHCR's theme for World Refugee Day is Hope Away from Home. We want to thank all of our partners who are helping to create hope away from home for those whose lives are disrupted by conflict and violence. You're truly doing life-saving work. We know no one single country can respond alone, and no country is untouched by the impacts of forced displacement. But working together, we can help meet immediate humanitarian needs and respond so that forcibly displaced persons can live in hope and dignity. I'd also like to recognize the work of so many women at the front lines of humanitarian response in the MENA region and beyond, many of whom are impacted personally by conflict and displacement. Your resilience builds a more informed response, stronger communities, and hope for the future. Thank you to the Wilson Center and to those who are tuning in today for your leadership and partnership to uplift the stories, recognize the contributions, and resolve the plight of persecuted and forcibly displaced women and girls and other people in the Middle East and North Africa and beyond. I'll now turn it back to the Wilson Center for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for your remarks, for reminding us of how much the United States contributes as a leading donor to multiple international organizations, but also local and regional organizations that address the multitude of challenges. U.S. leadership is critical in this regard. So we have a few questions that we wanted to get your expertise on. So in many displacement settings, there's usually a scarcity of sex disaggregated data and sufficient information flows about girls and women. We've seen multiple reports, most recently by the World Bank, that assessed the impact on women and girls, because this is really an area that we know, but we don't understand fully. So how does the United States play a role in ensuring that we have more data to better understand the challenges and therefore identify opportunities?
Thanks, Marissa. Well, we know that without sufficient sex and gender disaggregated data on forcibly displaced women and girls, there's no way to fully understand the unique challenges faced by this population. And we obviously then can't design policies and programs for their protection based in data and evidence without that data and evidence. So frequent, representative, and interoperable data collection is vital to ensuring the improved protection and well-being of forcibly displaced women and girls. There is a significant gap in the availability of such data, but the humanitarian community is beginning to make some real strides towards addressing it. The U.S. is proud to contribute to some of those strides. First is the World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center, which supports the collection and analysis of data and the maintenance of global data collection system and norms that are helping to address that data gap. The JDC's work helps to inform humanitarian programming and diplomacy and supports greater data-driven decision-making by humanitarian and development partners globally in situations of forced displacement. And again, we are very, very pleased to support that. In addition, I'd like to highlight the expert group on refugee, IDP, and statelessness statistics, which includes representation from the U.S. Census Bureau and is funded through the JDC, which has released official guidance on the inclusion of forcibly displaced persons in national surveys. That better ensures that women and girls in this population are represented when using these surveys to then develop policy. The United States is also continues to require that its funded NGO partners report sex disaggregated data for key indicators. And we also advocate for the expansion of sex disaggregated data by our international organization, UN partners, and others. I want to emphasize that PRM's role in advocating for safe and ethical GBV data collection is extremely important to us.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, almost done. While GBV data is important to understand service provision needs and gaps, we emphasize our conversations within the department as well as with donors, other donors and partners, that the collection of data and sharing of data can't come at the expense of taking a survivor-centered approach, and it can't be procured in a way that would put survivors or service providers at risk. So data should always be collected in a way that is safe and ethical. Should not be collected that we have to maintain confidentiality and safety should be at the forefront. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And since you've mentioned GBV in particular, and in your remarks reminded us that the United States remains to be a top humanitarian donor, but particularly to GBV prevention and response in emergencies worldwide. What more can be done by donors to GBV prevention and response in terms of advocacy and in interactions with other donors? For humanitarian actors, for example, who are also working in these countries, what would help donors make decisions in terms of funding and prioritization?
Right. Yeah. In fiscal year 2023, the State Department and USAID collectively provided nearly $228 million for dedicated GBV prevention and response programming at the global, regional, and country levels. That includes that Safe from the Start initiative I talked about earlier. And this reflects a continued upward trend since Safe from the Start began in 2013. So, that really, I think, is a demonstration of our commitment as the US government to addressing GBV globally. In terms of donors, we encourage states and donors to include robust humanitarian assistance for GBV prevention and response. This even in the face of increasing global humanitarian needs and increasingly strained budgets that we all have in a situation that I think many are very aware of. But the gap between identified needs and available donor funding for GBV prevention and response remains an urgent issue. Unfortunately, there's no foreseeable circumstance where donor funding meets the needs as currently articulated. So while we continue to work to expand the donor base, including through private sector and development actor engagement to complement this humanitarian base that we have, we also have to continue efforts to encourage partners to adapt their operational approaches to more effectively navigate this reality. We know that a lack of coordination can inadvertently also undermine the broader humanitarian response to GBVs, so including by putting survivors and first responders at risk. So it's especially important for donors to share best practices with each other, and we also want to work closely with peer donors in multiple contexts to coordinate and collaborate on programming priorities. We regularly lead and engage with these types of discussions through the call to action on the protection from gender-based violence in emergencies. It's a global multi-stakeholder initiative that was launched in 2013 and comprised of 100 states, donors, international organizations, and NGOs. And since last January, the US has co-chaired the States and Donors Working Group within that. Finally, turning to partners, as donors, we find it especially helpful when humanitarian actors can provide on the ground level insights about what is working or red flags for gaps in services. This is particularly important where we are relying on remote monitoring. So I would just make a plea and say that as an example of analysis that is very useful for donors is the implication is, helping us understand the implication of not funding something. This can make the programming more tangible and especially help donor staff who are not protection experts in the field. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, we very often talk about how challenging and of course at the risks of forced displacement is on women and girls. But there are also forces of resilience. In many cases, they had households in refugee camps and in other host communities, and they're forced to work when traditionally perhaps they didn't, in order to make ends meet for their families. So how can we work to support them, but also to ensure that this narrative about refugees and IDPs is not constantly a victim narrative?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really important piece to highlight, particularly when you're talking about women and girls and these impacts. So first of all, localization and innovative financing for women-led organizations is essential to advancing gender equality and promoting GBV programming. And so this is one of, yet again, to go back to Save from the Start, but this is one of the key objectives of Save from the Start re-envisioned. And in programs where more broadly PRM is, in our programs, we are more broadly prioritizing inclusion and self-reliance of forcibly displaced populations, in part by strengthening our policy framework for accountability to affected persons. The aim is to support the dignity and agency of those populations and to contribute to their local economies and over time foster self-reliance. I can say that I really saw this in action in Jordan recently when I met with a young woman who was participating in a UNICEF-funded program on focusing on climate resilient agricultural techniques and increasing market access among refugee youth and their communities. Through the program, this young woman, this young mother, was helping support her entire family into the future as a hydroponic agricultural producer and entrepreneur. And this was particularly important to her. And I think we can see why as we facing the specter of water scarcity and the climate crisis on the horizon. We're also pursuing innovative ways of using funding, working more closely with refugee-led organizations, private sector development actors, including multilateral development banks. So we're funding refugee-led organizations through UNHCR's Refugee-Led Innovation Fund, including one refugee-led organization in the MENA region, which is an arts therapy program in Yemen for displaced children with disabilities, and it aims to build trauma coping mechanisms, enhance communication and social skills, and providing support and awareness for their families as well. In addition, over 20 years, PRM has been providing direct support to dozens of local NGOs annually with small localized grants through the Julia Taft Fund. Individual Taft grants are limited to $25,000, but starting in FY22, we allowed our embassies to apply for up to a cumulative $75,000 total if the multiple proposals target PRM priority populations, such as stateless persons, women and girls, and LGBTQI plus refugees. So the number of projects that we funded through this grant has increased by over 25% since through 2023. And we've provided nearly $2 million in Taft funds to support 76 projects in 56 countries. So really that localized response to, in particular, women and refugee-led organizations is really where we want to see it alongside those innovations that I talked about. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is really important. We've hosted a few Syrian women on our podcast that focused on entrepreneurship to just showcase that even in the most difficult circumstances, there are, as you mentioned, innovative ways, and there are funds that support these initiatives, but we also need to highlight them. As you mentioned, it's important to tell these stories. Lindsay Jenkins, thank you again for your valuable insights and most importantly, all the work that you do in this space at the State Department. Thank you. We will now turn to our expert panel. I'm delighted to first introduce my colleague at the Middle East program, Faria Nasruddin, who will serve as moderator, Yara Asi, who's assistant professor at the University of Central Florida, Lina Sergi Attar, who is founder of the Karam Foundation, and Riva Dingra, who is policy and planning advisor at the International Rescue Committee. A reminder to the audience to tweet your questions to @WilsonCenterMEP. And without further ado, Faria, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you again to Lindsay Jenkins for her keynote remarks. As Marissa mentioned, I'm Faria Nasruddin, and I'm honored to be moderating this expert panel on the gendered impacts of forced displacement. Today's discussion will primarily focus on three questions, which is, firstly, how do women uniquely experience forced displacement? How do policymakers account or fail to account for these conditions? And what strategies have women used in situations of forced displacement in order to survive, to cope, and for resilience? And so firstly, since we have a pretty packed panel today, I'll turn it over to Yara to begin talking about the current situation happening in Palestine and in Gaza.
Thank you, Faria, and thank you to the Wilson Center for the invitation. We have just some brief time for these opening remarks, and obviously a lot to get into, so I will try to be very mindful. I'm Yara Asi, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the situation of forced displacement as it relates to the Palestinian Territories. Obviously, right now, the world's attention is on the Gaza Strip, but unfortunately, the story of Palestinian displacement starts almost a century ago. You know, I have obviously been asked to speak a lot about Palestine in the past couple of months. I almost forget how long it's been. And it has, one thing that I have noted is just how often, every time I speak, it has deteriorated more and more consistently. We are now in a even worse place than we were in April, March, when we were getting these warnings of famine. And so I first, before I talk about this acute situation, want to talk a little bit about the history of displacement, again, being very mindful of the time here. In 1948, we had this first massive forced displacement of Palestinians in what is widely known as the Nakba. This is, of course, Arabic for catastrophe, in which at least 700,000 Palestinians were displaced from their villages in the establishment of the State of Israel. And so what happened was many of these, and these were maps created by one of my colleagues at the FXB Center, Sausan, many Palestinians were able to stay within the area. So many from what became Israel fled into the West Bank. Many fled into what used to be the Gaza district, is now the Gaza Strip. So when we talk about Gaza today, and we're hearing these statistics that 80% are Palestinian refugees, one of the questions I get asked frequently is, well, they're in Palestinian territory, how are they refugees? And the answer is they're not from the Gaza Strip. They're from Haifa, they're from Jaffa, they're from other areas throughout historic Palestine. And because one of these long-term issues is that this issue of Palestinian statelessness has not ever been meaningfully addressed by the international community. So many Palestinians based after the 1948 to 1967 period, when the West Bank was administered by Jordan and Gaza was administered by Egypt, do hold dual citizenship, but many Palestinians only hold the Palestinian Authority passport, which is basically just a travel document. And so unlike many of the other settings we're discussing here today, Palestine is not a state, a sovereign state, as we address it. And many of the people who fled in 1948 have nowhere to return to. They may be in the West Bank, they may be in Gaza, they may be in Lebanon, they may be in Syria. And so this is a primary consideration when we're talking about the flight of Palestinians over time. And this is, of course, bringing to mind a lot of questions about this current situation. Again, many of the people in Gaza today have no homes to return to. Their homes have been destroyed. And even if reconstruction efforts are possible, we have years of clearing ordnance, clearing environmental hazards. So return is another big struggle here. This is a photo from the Nakba in 1948. You can see here, most of the adults in this photo are women. They're traveling with their children. They're carrying probably, I can imagine, food or clothing, whatever they were able to take from their homes. Now, in 1948, many of these Palestinians assumed that they would return home, and that's why the symbol of Palestinian refugees is their keys. They literally took their keys with them, assuming they would return home. And of course, as we know, many of them, most of them never did. So when we see images like this from Gaza today, we are, of course, left to wonder, where will these people go? What will their status be? Many of them have no legal status outside of, some sort of Palestinian ID. So that's those who have found themselves in Egypt, if some have, what becomes of them after this? So in terms of the specific effects on women, I think it was very widely publicized that the death toll early on was about 70% women and children. And we have now seen that number stay steady around between 60, 50%. And so, as we know, women in these extremely fragile situations, and frankly, in all countries of the world, if we're being honest, are charged with most caregiving duties, taking care of the household duties, taking care of children. And so when we see in Gaza today, the level of famine, the level of destruction, the lack of access to services, we can assume that this is being felt extremely acutely by women and especially mothers. And some of these circumstances we have heard are frankly terrible. I mean, we have heard dozens of children starving to death. We have heard of the conditions in the shelters in the south of Gaza. They were in Rafah, now they're in another potentially or supposedly humanitarian area. And the health impacts have been absolutely brutal. We are having, you know, significant rates of malnutrition. Pregnant and nursing mothers are unable to produce milk. Their bodies are under so much mental and physical stress that they are literally unable to care for their children. They fled their homes, sometimes again thinking they'd go back, and now they have been displaced 4, 5, 6, 7 times from one shelter to an uncle's house, to another shelter, to a school, to a neighbor's house, over and over and over. The cost for leaving Gaza today, you have to pay these very high fees to Egyptian authorities that are thousands of dollars per person, including children. This is multiple times of the annual salary per year of many people in Gaza who cannot afford this. And especially when you consider that their houses and all of their resources have been destroyed, many of them are left penniless and are entirely dependent on humanitarian services. And as I end here, I just want to note that the primary agency that is dealing with these refugees, UNRWA, which has existed since 1949 and was established by the West to deal with Palestinian refugees, has been smeared, frankly, in the past few months, and has led to many countries, including the United States, cutting funding, which basically the entire humanitarian community has warned there is no other agency that is able to reach, has the capacity, has the local staff, knows the people. I mean, this is also important, right? Like UNRWA. And so this is an ongoing crisis. So when we couple this with the historical and crisis of the Nakba, now we can look at retrospectively and see what the consequences of that were. We're now looking at this acute crisis that is playing out as we speak. And it is incredibly unfortunate to see that many of the same issues that were dealt with all those decades ago are being felt by Palestinian women today. And I'll get into a bit more of that a bit later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Yara. Next, I'd like to turn to Sola. Sola is from Afghanistan, and she will tell us a little bit more about her personal and familial and lived experience with the gendered impact of forced displacement. To you, Sola. Sola, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think as Yara mentioned, yeah, the impact on women. For example, I mean, I think being the word refugee, all this evoked so many emotion. Myself, I know I was living in Afghanistan and now in the US, and there's so many things. But the things that, you know, when I see, you know, oh, in a play, like, you know, on the news, I see the word war and everything, but it reminds me of my own family experience during the civil war in Afghanistan. My mother was at that time pregnant with my older sister, and there was rocket firing in Kabul, and before that, my mother gave birth in a hospital, and one of her concern with this child was like, where is she gonna give birth? But somehow that, you know, she did give birth, and then there was this, you know, the rockets were like were increasing. There were different sides fighting, and then so they did not know from where the next rocket is gonna get fired, and so they had to leave Kabul, and you know they walked, and then so my mother at that time, like she recently gave birth, and then so my sister was on my father's shoulder. And they were walking, there's like my other siblings, so my mom is holding them, and then they're just walking, and then at some point my mom realizes like, wait, is like, she looks at my father like, do you still have the child? And every time my mom would say like, there was just like 2 seconds left between my father, like my sister just going on my father was just holding it like her 2 feet because there was so much that their minds were somewhere else, and so every time we would go back and look at my sister, we would be so like just between the death, there were just a few seconds in between that my father would just have lost her. So these are the things. And then also I think the narrative of being a refugee is so dehumanized, and I can speak about Afghan experiences that even when I was for example, I was coming to the US, and I as a student, and when I went to for the visa, and that visa was denied in 1 minute, it was because like the story is just like, oh, you just want to go there to immigrate and then you're going to be dependent on us. So yeah, I think it's so important not just to talk about the extreme situations that women are dealing with, but also that before you become a refugee, you had a life, you had dreams, you have hopes, and the least one can do is to give them a space, because one loses so much in war, and most of the time it is like a lot of the country that we're trying to immigrate are responsible for our displacement.
Thank you, Sola. That was an incredibly powerful story. And on that note, I'm going to turn to Lena, who works as a practitioner leading the Karam Foundation, and she will talk a little bit about similarly her experience with women-led households in the aftermath of the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria.
Thank you so much, Faria, and thank you both, Yara and Sola, for your incredible accounts. I apologize that my voice, I have a little bit of a cold, so my voice is not that strong, but I just wanted to, really echo the pieces that Yara and Sola brought up. We see this again in Syria as well. And I run Karam Foundation. Karam means generosity in Arabic. And we've been functioning inside Syria and in Turkey and other locations since 2011. Primarily, our work right now is based in Turkey. And what we've seen over the past 13 years since the revolution began in 2011 in Syria, and there is massive waves of displacement. Over 12 million people lost their homes in Syria, about 7 million people internally displaced, and over 5 million people becoming refugees outside of the country, specifically in Turkey, where Karam works. There are 3.7 million registered Syrian refugees, and we suspect the number is much higher now. And so if you put your empathy and your imagination into the shoes of a Syrian refugee woman in southern Turkey in Hatay, it means over the past 13 years, you've been displaced from your home multiple times. You've probably witnessed or had been a victim to violence. You have watched the destruction of your own home or town or village. You've lived in refugee camps, probably starting in IDP camps until you were able to even cross the border. And then you finally arrive in southern Turkey, and you have a new language that you don't know. There's very little opportunity for you. You're unwanted by this country. And then on top of everything else, eventually the pandemic happens. And when you're in the pandemic, you are isolated in your own home. And suddenly if you're lucky enough for your children to not be in child labor, you are going to have to homeschool these children in a foreign language. And the majority of Syrian children and youth in Turkey do experience bullying in their schools, which we work with a lot of parents. Parents have very little support systems are able to work with that, because they're very much the minority and on the outskirts of society, and feel very weak when even confronting, for instance, a Turkish teacher about instances of bullying with their own children. So you feel very disempowered. And then on top of all of this, in 2023, the earthquake happens in Hatay, which displaced hundreds of thousands of people in southern Turkey and in northern Syria. And so what we've been working on for the past about almost a year and a half, is the aftermath of the earthquake within Syrian refugee communities. And the reality is many of these many of these households are female-led households, mothers who the father either cannot provide for them, or they are not there. And this is something very common. So we do see a lot of families needing to have to send their children to child labor, as well as child marriages. And this is something that we've been working on from the beginning, since we worked in southern Turkey, about how do you support a refugee family. And the approach that it becomes really, really important is, how do we actually support them today, which is being able to provide them with the basic necessities, being able to provide them with the financial support to be able to cover their rent, to get their basic necessities. And at the same time, how are we investing in the future? Because we don't want to just be able to kind of create that Band-Aid situation of aid to just get you through today or this month. But it's really important for us to put the children, make sure the children and the youth are going to school, are being able to reach their full potential, to be able to give that support to the mothers. And we found that solution and that approach very, very powerful, and it works because within a few years you find the children, we have children that we found in child labor who now attend university. And our whole approach is, how do we actually not end, you can't change or reverse the experience of a refugee, but what you can do is not create that to be an identity that shouldn't define people forever. It's a circumstance that they live through, that the only thing that separates somebody like me, who did not go through that as a Syrian American, is just the luck of where I was born. And so I try every day, and with our team try every day, is how do we actually create that situation where, 5-10 years from now, we see vibrant refugee communities and people integrated into society wherever they want to live, and being able to live in work and dignity and have their own agency. And I'll get into more of the details of that work in the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lena. That was a very comprehensive overview of not only the short-term crises situations, but the long-term sort of solutions and path forward. And I'm hoping to touch a little bit more on that in my questions. But last but not least, I'll turn to Reva, another practitioner, to give us an overview of the programming side of things.
Thanks so much, Maria, and thanks to everyone for sharing these. I'll just keep my remarks brief and build on a lot of what the other panelists have already covered. So as everyone has noted, forced migration has a disproportionate impact on women and girls. So 3 years ago, IRC, in collaboration with Georgetown University's Institute for Women, Peace and Security, adapted and applied Georgetown's quantitative Women, Peace and Security Index to systematically measure the situation of displaced women. And we found that displaced women experience an average disadvantage of about 24%, even compared to host community women. So there's disadvantages both compared to men, and then within countries also compared to host community women. Displaced women are facing greater economic marginalization, financial exclusion, and restrictions on mobility. They also face much higher risks and host community members of intimate partner violence at home. So that rises as high as 42% more likely to experience intimate partner violence in South Sudan, for example. And these dynamics also really hold for displaced women and girls in the Middle East. So in Lebanon, for example, only 15% of Syrian women have legal residency. Displaced Syrian women in Lebanon are at disproportionate risk of experiencing gender-based violence. So in 2022, 74% of registered female GBV survivors in Lebanon were Syrian. That also has to do with reporting and coming forward. But in Gaza, we're seeing that more than 1 million Palestinian women and girls are facing catastrophic hunger, with almost no access to food, safe drinking water, functioning toilets, or running water, creating life-threatening risks from a survival and hygiene standpoint. So talking about where women, as Swala mentioned, where women are going to give birth. I mean, this is a real issue when you have most of the health infrastructure completely destroyed. And access to clean water is also especially critical for breastfeeding mothers and pregnant women who have higher daily water and caloric intake requirements. But when most of the population is drinking basically contaminated water because there's no other source, you have communicable diseases spreading that are increasing the risk of maternal mortality. I mean, basic issues such as access to hygiene products that are part of our everyday lives as women that we take for granted. I mean, it's a luxury at this point. And one thing I also want to talk about, what we're seeing at IRC is this newly intensifying dimension of the convergence of conflict and climate change and its impacts on forcibly displaced women. So in addition to people being forced to flee extreme weather events, natural disasters, climate change is also intensifying existing drivers of migration and displacement. It's acting as a threat multiplier and in many ways exacerbating already existing inequalities in fragile and conflict-affected countries. So already marginalized groups, particularly women and girls, are facing disproportionate impact from this new convergence, and not even new, intensifying convergence of climate and conflict. So women and girls are particularly likely to depend on livelihoods threatened by climate change, especially agriculture. They're traditionally tasked with jobs managing natural resources, such as collecting water and firewood. Women are being forced to travel longer distances for these things, including visiting water points at night, which is increasing the risk of GBV. Girls are also more likely to be taken out of school to support the family, and also early marriage. So as an organization whose mandate is to respond to and support communities in crisis, we're tackling the gendered impacts of forced displacement, both explicitly through or women and girls specific programming, but we're also arguing for gender mainstreaming throughout all programming. So always having a gender dimension to the work that we're doing as a humanitarian organization. And humanitarian organizations can't do this alone. It really is also about national policy frameworks. It's about tackling inequalities between displaced people and host communities, and looking at the policy environment as well. So I'm happy to talk in the Q&A more about specific programming responses.
Thank you, Reva. Building on what you were just saying about how climate change is multiplying the effects of the conditions of women and girls in displacement, I'd like to ask the panel as a whole, what exactly are we seeing, not only as the long-term impacts of forced displacement, but more specifically, how are we seeing women and children, or women and girls, more specifically, coping with the vulnerabilities that they're facing? Are they implementing certain strategies? Are they, taking on additional practices, either positive or negative? Anyone is welcome to take this, but if not, I'll turn, I think, to either Reva or Lena to kick us off on that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to talk specifically about a community that we're working with, which is a community of about 20,000 Syrian refugees living in a camp that was established specifically for people who've lost their homes in the earthquake. And it's really shocking the way that they've people, when the earthquake happened in February of 2023, there's a group of the most vulnerable Syrians living in informal tent communities because of the earthquake, kind of forgotten on the sidelines. Finally, the government created this container camp for about 20,000 people, and it was just starting to be built in November. So they spent already being displaced 6-7 months, and this camp is still not fully occupied. And it's really, when I went to that camp just a few weeks ago, the containers that people were given were completely stripped containers, so you get nothing in the container. People just had whatever they had left from these tents, and had lost everything they had in the earthquake. So when I was meeting with mothers, I mean, the heartbreaking part of this is that they had already been displaced 10 to 13 years ago multiple times, and to have to go back to that situation of again losing everything, again starting from zero and being completely reliant on whatever services are available, which are very little. It's very hard to even talk about, what strategies they're taking, because I was seeing like, already they had been in the camp just a few months, and we were seeing health risks. There's no running water. The communal bathrooms are in a horrible state. There's like very little amenities. A school is still now being built, so now their children have been their education has been disrupted yet again. And so, we have two community centers in the camps, and really working with younger children. We're finding illiteracy rates are very high, and a lot of mothers would stop me and say, like, help me get medical support, help me try to be able to find, how am I supposed to find a living, what are we supposed to do next, how long am I going to be here? And these questions are just impossible to answer, because we all know if schools are being built in this camp setting, then I think that they're going to be there for a long time. But refugees, like they can't even imagine themselves living long term in this place. And so the amount of support that's needed is so high. And what we saw in the aftermath of the earthquake is a huge outpouring of support from the international community, to many organizations and many agencies. And that's incredible, because when a natural disaster happens in a war-torn area, the effects are so much more multiplied. But what we're not seeing, like, for instance, people right now don't even think about the earthquake as a long-term disaster, as a long-term issue that we need to deal with. And that's, I think, what I would urge people listening to think about, that an earthquake is a long-term crisis, and rebuilding and getting people into homes again and getting people back on their feet again. Many Turkish people have been experiencing this, but if you're a refugee, it's times 100, and if you're a woman, it's times 100. So I would urge people to think about the earthquake as a long-term emergency situation, and how we can actually support families to be able to get back to that level of self-sustainability that they were prior to the earthquake.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lena. Reflecting on what you were saying, it just seems like this state of limbo that a lot of refugee families, women, children are in is, in essence, it's debilitating, and that there needs to be a push from both the international donors and policymakers in order to generate long-term sustainable plans, in essence. I'd like to turn now to the rest of the panel if they have anything to add on this question of long-term impact, either from a broader level, from Reva, or from Palestine, from the perspectives of Palestine and Afghanistan, either from Yara or Sola.
I'll just briefly interject with, I think the circumstances of displacement moderate the response significantly. So when we're in acute situations, for example, now in Gaza, really survival is the priority. And we have seen, families, I've seen videos of young girls, 6, 7, 8 years old, selling corn for a shekel so that their family can get some money to buy food from the market. We've seen women trying to make their tents as home-like as possible, doing wash with the same water 5 days in a row. Many of these women at this point are widowed or separated from their husbands. Their husbands have been detained. And we're all speaking here about largely patriarchal societies where women don't work as much, and where men are the primary breadwinners, and where women tend to have more children. So the effects of displacement, even if we're talking about the death toll of men, and I think we also want to be careful here when saying that men are also civilians. And so when we talk about women and children versus men, we tend to put men in this bucket of combatants, which is inaccurate and dehumanizing. But when we talk about the loss of men, the detainment of men, we also lose the effect of that on the women who had been dependent on that man working. And so now we have women who have, no work experience. Perhaps they have education, but now they're charged with taking care of children, trying to get themselves out of the country. in extremely complex settings where there's 6, 7 agencies working, they simply are trying to figure out, who do I even talk to meet my basic needs? When we have long-term displacement, I think even when I have spoken to people who were displaced in 1948 or in 1967, and by all accounts now are fine. They're stable, they have new citizenship somewhere, they're living in a safe environment. This never leaves you. Some of them still struggle with not just the physical effects of their displacement, but the mental trauma of being forced from your home, at first not knowing if you'll ever return, and then slowly coming to the realization that you never will. This never leaves you. These people can tell you what they were wearing on the day they left their home, what their mother was cooking, what their house looked like. And I think we too often think, let's just get them settled and safe, and then they'll be fine. But we too often forget that the dispossession of your home is a very painful and traumatic experience that never leaves these people. And so we need to, I think, be doing more efforts to not just get them economically secure and physically safe, but also to deal with what is a multi-generational trauma, because then they tell their children about their home, and then their children tell their children. I mean, this is the Palestinian story. So, and it's often carried on through the women of the family.
Absolutely, and thank you for both your comments on the acute crisis, but also, multi-generational spanning situations of displacement and the impact that it can have not only situationally, but also mentally and generationally. Reva Arasola, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I can just highlight or really underscore the point that Yara just made on the mental health impacts. I mean, it's often as Lindsay mentioned, we're in an environment of severe funding constraints. Last year was the biggest gap in humanitarian financing in history. This year is the first time that the humanitarian sector is targeting fewer people in need and a lower percentage of the people determined to be in need, and that all has an impact on programming, explicitly at gender-based violence or trauma and psychosocial support for women and girls. So an example is in the Sudan response for you have women who have directly experienced gender-based violence. We have mass reports of sexual assault, of trauma, and then arriving in transit camps in Chad in the middle of the desert where IRC employed the only trained psychiatrist in the country at that point to provide mental health support, but it's wildly insufficient. It's not sustainable, and thinking about what actions that can be taken at the start of displacement to help mitigate the impacts, the mental health impact in particular, longer term. A lot of people are needing really high level support that is just not there because the resources aren't there.
Thank you, Riva. And that transitions actually quite nicely into my next question, which is more specifically on how to translate the experiences that you're hearing about, that you're seeing firsthand, into policy solutions. What messages do policymakers need to hear, or what needs to happen on a national or international level in order to account for both mental health trauma and economic livelihoods and so on and so forth? And this is to anyone.
I will just briefly start by saying, sometimes I think we're starting these conversations too late. We are talking about response. And as Riva just mentioned, I don't know if there's ever been a year when humanitarian pledges have actually met the need. And so it begs the question, how can we stop having to respond to humanitarian crises? It is all well and good to donate to funds for refugees and to do all this, but we are still stuck in this militaristic mindset that there are military solutions to what are really political problems, thus causing massive refugee crises that then have to be responded to. And too often, I think we are forgetting that some of the top countries that are donating to refugee or any humanitarian response organizations are also the top countries that are contributing politically, militarily, economically, et cetera, to, I mean, the countries where, that are in the most fragile in the world. Every country that we're talking about today has been very significantly impacted by primarily Western foreign policy. The best way to help women and girls is not to bomb their countries that they're living in and force them to then face these impossible decisions of where do we go and what do we do and do we stay and you go here and I go here. I mean, we've already lost so much by the time we're getting to that point. So we need to have a shift in how we see what meaningful intervention looks like. Many have spoken about this as a more feminist foreign policy, but frankly, I just think it makes more sense if we can prevent crises from happening. We don't have to expend so much effort on responding to them. And then we can really truly say that we value women and girls, we value their equity, we value their economic development. We cannot save them by forcing them into these situations of desperation. And so I think the conversation needs to start before they're even made as refugees as to the political choices that are leading them to become that. And this includes with the climate crisis that Riva brought up. We don't have any tangible mechanisms for dealing with climate refugees. We don't even consider them refugees, and yet every projection shows that they are increasing. What are we going to do about that? We can't just be responding. We have to be proactive and put our values into action. And I don't think that comes with bombing.
Absolutely. And Reva, I see you would like to say
no,
something.
I can just add to that. I mean, the biggest thing we can do for women and girls, whether it's in Gaza or in Sudan, is a ceasefire. Sustained ceasefires are the number one thing we can do to protect women and girls. That means in Sudan, also exerting pressure on parties to the war and who are often committing some of the assaults themselves and are the main perpetrators, and looking at the political dimensions of it. Absolutely. And then it's also not just about preventing crises from starting. It's also about addressing the number of protracted crises that are already existing. So the vast majority of humanitarian financing goes to people living in protracted crises that have lasted 5 years or more, over 85%. And that is most of the resources. We're not doing enough to, resolve a lot of these long-running conflicts or, make the conditions for safe return or local integration or resettlement available. So absolutely, looking at those causes is essential. I think from a programming dimension, given that we're operating in this environment as a service provider, it means advocacy along these dimensions. It means working along these policy dimensions, not just with the funding governments, but also with host governments. So, for example, trying to get displaced people included in national protection systems, and looking at the gender dimension of the disproportionate impact of legal regimes on displaced women and girls in the countries that they're hosted in, as well as targeted support. So things like psychosocial support, trauma programming, safe spaces for women-specific entrepreneurship initiatives that enable female-headed households to gain more control over their lives. Childcare, I think that's a big thing that we don't talk about, is like a lot of these women are the main source of childcare for their children. So then when you're losing your spouse, you are both responsible for taking care of children and responsible for income generation to support those children if you don't have a family network. So looking at childcare is really important here. And then also in climate programming, because women women are becoming, heads of households and are already participating in agriculture. So, for example, in Northeast Syria, they are participating in the agricultural space, making sure that programs that are aimed at mitigating the impacts of climate change and helping communities adapt explicitly include women. As we've done in a seed security program, partnering with female farmers to test drought-resistant wheat seeds. These are all extremely important. So we have to work along all dimensions right now, which is slightly terrifying, but we have to. So yeah, that's about it.
And then, go ahead, Sola.
Yeah, also I think it's important. I think there's a lot of, you have to kind of change, like, what do we mean by change? It's just a person just saying, oh, I built a school there, and then they take a picture with that school, and then there's a few poverty-stricken in place and with children, and then that becomes the point of success. And I think we have to kind of also move from that way of like most of it still, I think in Afghanistan still now, that's how the NGOs are operating, or just like the big announcements, that we are doing this and that, and then there's no follow-up, there is no way to measure that. And when we live in a time where we can have access to local people, where we can measure those changes, and what that would allow also is that we don't rest our hope on a useless figurehead who just wants their name to be out on the front. And I see it with a lot with Afghan and in Afghanistan, especially with women's rights and everything. There isn't anything tangible that's really happening, but there's this big facade of change that's people have been talking about. So I think using the technology that we have, we can really have to change our minds the way we are making changes.
Thank you, Sola. And then,
Sorry, I just want to add one thing. I mean, that's an extremely important point. And, we're not doing better in terms of following through on the commitments to decolonization and localization of responses. So in 2022, only 1% of funding went to directly to local organizations or national organizations. For refugee-led organizations, that number is even smaller. It's like 0.0005% or something. It's extremely small. So $26 million total out of billions and billions of dollars. So I think that's a key point, is making sure responses are sustainable and followed through by the people who are most invested in them is key.
And then I want to leave some time for audience Q&A, but I'd like to hear if Lena has any last remarks on this question that you would like to share.
No, I'm in complete agreement with the panelists, and absolutely, I mean, I think the most important message here is to stop the wars that are continuing and a ceasefire immediately, because this is something that we talked about for so many years as Syrians, to stop people from becoming refugees. So I identified really a lot with what Yara was talking about, and that's the most important thing that can happen now, is to stop people from becoming displaced and becoming refugees from the beginning as it's happening, and we don't do enough of that, not even close.
Thank you all for your remarks, both big picture and in the granular details as well. I have so far 2 questions from the audience that I'll pitch to you, but I'd like to also remind everyone that they can submit questions either via the chat on the live stream or Twitter or via email. The first question is a little bit granular, but we have one member writing in. As a growing NGO servicing displaced women, they ask what recommendations the panel has for facilitating needs assessment with camps and building relationships with the communities that they're serving, especially when communities are multicultural.
I mean, I can jump in here quickly, just because this is something we're doing right now. I think whether you're in a camp or in any area where you're working with displaced communities, I think the most important thing that you can do is to first listen and spend a lot of time with people, listening to what the issues actually are, And when you're building solutions, obviously having, you know, your team should be a local team, and you should be any kinds of solutions or ideas or programming that you would want to implement, that that the local team plus the people that are being served to be considered co-authors of the solutions. You can't come and like design a solution and implement and think that this is going to be like the right thing to do, or the thing that's sustainable, or the one that's going to have the most impact. What we found in our work is we get the most impact when the people in the community are the ones kind of directing and are in the driver's seat of what needs to be done and how, and being treated as partners in whatever we're doing. Because at the end of the day, that's kind of like what we want to do, is to create a better present and a better future for these communities, and you can only do it with them as partners.
Thank you. If anyone has anything to add, please feel free, but if not, I'll turn to the second question, which might be for Yara more specifically. We have another audience member asking if there are any NGO representatives in Gaza that you're able to, the universal you, communicate with to design and implement recommendations and actions.
Well, I mean, there are many NGOs on the ground, and we've seen many of their top spokespeople either entering Gaza or making kind of a symbolic visit to Rafah when Gaza itself was more insecure, or whatever that means right now. But yeah, I don't think the what's been very clear, and I can actually laud the humanitarian community for this, is they have not minced words about what they're seeing and what they're experiencing and what is needed. I mean, basically, since mid-October, they were saying we need a ceasefire, we need unimpeded access to aid. And then they have spent the past 9 months documenting what has happened as a result of that. We saw a slight push in aid entering in April, and then on May 6th, they closed the Rafah border, and since then it's been absolutely terrible. We just had James Elder from UNICEF give a detailed I tried to travel 25 kilometers. It took 13 hours. We had a truck with food and medicines that was approved, that was turned back. So I think the problem, interestingly, is not that we don't know what is needed, or the humanitarian community doesn't know what, the needs are very obvious. The question is, in this specific case, that we have Israel, and again, with the support of much of the West, is not allowing what needs to happen. So we have, it's unclear. This is one of those questions where I actually don't know what else we can do, what more needs to be done. From the humanitarian sector, we can see the trucks of food and medicines and things at the border. There are people who would like to go in and distribute that. There are already people who would like to, help rebuild or at least clean up schools and hospitals so people can return. We've seen heroic efforts. It's just not being allowed to be a response effort, and that is part of this crisis, is that the entity that is responsible for the destruction is also essentially in control of the entire humanitarian response. And so while we have some good both local and international feedback on the ground, I mean, you can't open, at least my Twitter, perhaps my algorithm is ruined, but you can't open it without seeing firsthand accounts from people. This is what our shelter looks like. This is what our bed looks like. This is the water we have to drink for 3 days. I don't think it's in this case, it's not a lack of information. It's a lack of ability to respond appropriately.
Thank you, Yara. And then before we close, I'd like to ask if anyone on the panel has any closing remarks that they would like to leave with. If not, I'll share some of my takeaways from today's discussion. Okay, wonderful. So again, I'd like to thank the panel for today's discussion on the gendered impacts of forced displacement, and more broadly, what we're seeing as needed in refugee response at a big picture level in multiple contexts across the MENA region and Afghanistan. What I've gathered from today is that while there are heroic humanitarian efforts, what is lacking is not only the resources, meaning the funding atmosphere, but also the lacking of, as in essence, long-term political solutions that would transition response from band-aid solutions to more sustainable long-term solutions. And in that sense, I think that we see that across the variety of contexts we spoke about today, from Syria to Palestine to Afghanistan to Sudan, which Reva touched upon. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for their time, including the audience, and just would like to repeat once more how vital it is to underscore not only these stories from practitioners and firsthand accounts, but also the ways in which these stories are necessary to translate into real policy action. Once again, I'm Faria with the Middle East program at the Wilson Center, and I'd like to thank everyone for today.
Thank you, Faria, and everyone.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.